From the threads of lunaticoutpost.com, this is LOPsided Discussion. Our topic this evening is the Boston Marathon bombing. This is Liberty.
This is Entropy.
And this is Nolo.
All right, fellas. I guess let's start the discussion off with some observations that we've made about the date. Of course, it's tax day. Everyone's favorite day, at least in the States. Nolo, as you pointed out, it's Patriots Day for Boston.
Well, actually, for all of New England, it's the Lexington battle. It's the first shot of the Revolutionary War.
That's the shot heard around the world?
Yes, that's the one. Well, right there is significant. A shot heard around the world. So implications of a bombing like that, you can't help but notice. Yeah, maybe that's what they were trying to say.
It's got some global implications on it. There's a lot of things. That's also, I guess, Hitler's birthday. Not that has any direct implications or anything like that, but there's a lot of things that happen on April 15th. It's a really busy day in the year in history.
And not to make a joke about it, but it's also a day of the Boston Marathon, of course, which could in itself be a target if somebody's deranged enough to want to go out and try to cause a lot of damage to people.
That's true. It was broadcast on television, of course. So if something was going on in Boston, if it was an East Coast thing, that's probably one of the largest events that was taking place on the 15th. If they were trying to tie it to that date, and of course it's televised for massive coverage.
Yeah, there was a baseball game going on at the same time with a lot more of a target of opportunity, but then again, a lot more security.
Right, that's kind of a walled garden there where they've got kind of a limited access to get in there, and they've got like probably a pretty good system that they always go through every time with that particular location.
Once again, I think the choice of target is significant. It's what they call a soft target as opposed to a hard target. For instance, they didn't target a naval base or a power supply or a dam or a government building.
Right. They were going after people, I guess, hence the soft target aspect. Is that what that means? I'm not hip on that lingo.
Yeah, that's significance of a soft target is it's more for psychological damage than it is for actually damaging an enemy's infrastructure. In other words, if you want to disable an enemy, you can disable his ability to do things in his hardware, or you can disable his will to fight, or
attack his morale.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, they certainly did that. I see that the people on the Lunatic Outpost are just bonkers. I swear half that front page is probably related to the bombings on their threads.
There's a lot of people from New England on the website, too, I believe. From what I've seen, a lot of people are saying they're Northeast or Mid-Atlantic. So.
I'm about a 2.5-hour drive from Boston.
Well, that's scary. Fortunately, I'm a bit of a shut-in, so I don't make it out to mass events like that. I haven't been to a mall in probably over a decade. I'm glad about that now that things like that, well, not that, anything to be glad about, but, I certainly wouldn't have gotten caught up in that sucker.
What I find significant about it being a soft target is then it's obviously a psychological move. That's how they want to carry out the attack, is to put people in disruption or to put them into a different mindset. So anticipate what kind of mindset are they expecting out of people from this bombing.
Right. Another portion of that, I think they said that the bombs were kind of directed towards the crowd, not so much the runner. But it seems like most of the casualties were the lower body extremes. So if the runners did get hit, it was like hitting them where it hurt, what they're most prideful in, that being their legs carrying them through a marathon.
I'm inclined to think that it wasn't really aimed at the runners per se, because unless their timing was way off, most of the major runners had already crossed the line. So it seems to me if they had some kind of beef against running in general, that they would have set it so that as soon as the first groups of runners were coming across, they would have set them off.
That's a good point, Nolo. I saw on another thread that there was a possibility of a less strict supervision at that point, like the police and whoever was securing the situation, they would probably be most focused on something happening at that point. So like after that period passed, they would maybe have relaxed a little bit and gone back to walking their beat rather than, having all eyes out looking for kind of some suspect or something.
So I'm going to run with this psychological aspect and say, why did they target running? Well, yeah, there's a large crowd. There's international runners and all of that. But just in contrast, let me say, what if they were attacked a NASCAR event as opposed to, say, a running event? So what kind of people would attend a NASCAR, and what kind of people would be inclined to be attracted to a running event? Is there some sort of significance in the makeup of this kind of event? Who does this tend towards?
I hear what you're saying. It seems to be more of like I don't know if it would be an upper class thing, like more of like a golfing audience or something like that. Like if we were maybe to evaluate the political spectrum of the mindset of the people that were up there, it probably wouldn't necessarily be your conservative type of like Republicans or something like that. So I think it would be safe to say if someone is that what we're thinking about here, Nolo? Is like if it's somebody that might be aiming towards the liberals.
Yeah, if you want to, what you're hoping for as a result, if you're the person that puts the bomb, what kind of result are you looking for? And it seems to me, of course, it's a psychological thing. So who is this aimed at psychologically? Who would be most likely to be affected by this? A certain strata of society, like let's take the NASCAR thing. If that was attacked, what kind of reaction would that get, as opposed to, say, if you attacked a golf tournament, or if you attacked a military parade, or if you attacked a politician when he's up testifying about something. So maybe you could tell something about the psychology of the attacker by the choice of target. Unless this was just simply just a random target of opportunity. Oh boy, it's going to be in town. I'm here. I got bombs. Let's do it now. I don't know. It sounds a little bit more pre-planned than just a target of opportunity.
Now, interestingly, Alan Jones, who is an Australian broadcaster, hinted that liberal students from Harvard or MIT may have been the culprits trying to gain some sort of attention to something. Of course, there's nothing backing that claim whatsoever, but that's just one of the things that have been thrown out there in the press.
Entropy, does that mean he was referring to trying to get the attention of the Harvard, Yale, like Ivy League guys, or that they might be trying to get attention?
He didn't elaborate too much from what I read. From what I'm seeing, he made a statement on a television show called 2GB, on a segment called 2GB on Wednesday morning on Australian Channel 7 Sunrise, which I think is the equivalent to something like Good Morning America or the Today Show.
Got you.
So there's spin everywhere. There's a lot of international spin on it, and of course we're pointing fingers at everybody, and even what happened itself here in this country, trying to figure it out.
It's almost counterintuitive, though. You would think, say, someone liberal leaning would be anti-gun, and yet psychologically, these people milling around after the bombs went off, the first instinct is to defend themselves, and Americans are going to think grab a gun. So if that was the point, it seemed to be the wrong way to go about it.
would anger the people who are normally ringing towing the line of like no war, less guns, but actually making them angry and kind of lash out. And let's also remember the schools were closed, so there was a high probability of having children around too. So it's adding that to the psychological factor of that, more bad pun, more bang for the buck, I guess. That's a horrible pun.
Well, it's also the Claymore mine mentality. You don't want to kill the enemy. If you can wound great swaths of the enemy, they've got to take care of them. There's a psychological damage of watching them in pieces, screaming at your feet. I think that had a lot to do with how the bomb was constructed, that it did the from the waist down kind of damage, is that it wasn't necessarily to kill, but it was to cause the most damage and the most horrific type images. And so
right,
that
people
tells
screaming.
that tells you a lot about the attacker too.
Yeah, if that's the case, then I sincerely hope the attacker blew his own arms and legs off and has to live the rest of his life in prison like that, to the takings of his cohorts in there. Because I just have no sympathy for people with that kind of violent mentality.
Yeah, that's one thing to be mad at the enemy and eliminate the enemy. It's another thing just to cause suffering. Now that's a different notion, and that's a lingering thing. That's more scarring than the outright death of somebody.
Yeah, I kind of when the mainstream media started screaming about extremists this, extremists that, homegrown terrorists, it kind of didn't make that much sense to me, because they usually have, like, we had an incident here in Texas not all that long ago where a guy was losing his house, and it was through some type of tax, something to do with the IRS, and he got pissed off at the IRS, stole an airplane, and tried to fly the airplane into, like, the IRS wing of this building. Of course, going after the people that he's pissed off about. I don't really, certainly I don't think you could say that about a patriot, but some type of homegrown thing like that, it didn't really make sense to me that they would go after civilians necessarily. And it doesn't make sense that they would do that attacking people, in a way that might further put a microscope on our civil liberties, as far as, them peeling those back and getting more of a police state in order. It seems like it would do more harm than good in that situation.
Well, Tim McVeigh suffered from a severe PTSD. I don't think that he was thinking about the full implications of his actions, which I'm not condoning, in any way, which interestingly also took place on Patriots Day. This year it was on the 15th, but back then it was on the 19th. There's a lot of psychos out there, and their means will always outweigh their cause as far as what they do. I think the media is probably fishing around considering, the history of the date and what the media has previously reported, because they always build on what they have to work with.
Yeah, and they're not afraid to hop out there with bad information, as we know. I've still got a screen cap of the New York Post where they said it was like 22 dead and hundreds injured. And it's like they threw a dart at a dartboard and just pulled a number out of the air and threw that up. And, of course, they're not going to get in any trouble for that, because there really is no recourse for them reporting bad information.
Well, that's been true since Dewey defeated Truman. But that's the competitive nature of the business, is to get your story out there, and sometimes facts losing the weight of the argument when it comes to getting the information in.
Whoever did this, they didn't pick a shopping mall. They knew there was going to be extreme media coverage. So that's a factor.
Yeah, the placement also indicates that right behind the
fan stands?
Yeah, and there was a display of flags there and everything. At least in the first explosion. Second explosion, I'm not sure what the positioning was on it, but they definitely went for the, the media
The most effective spot for the psychological aspect, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point, Entropy.
Here's a strange one. The fact that if you were a liberal or you were a conservative, there, even if you know on the extremes of either end, there's nothing really to be gained by doing this. I mean, there's no point where you could shove, action reaction. You're trying to shove people in a direction by doing this shock and awe tactic. I tend to not think it's a domestic event because of that. There's nothing to be gained by, either side would stand to lose by the reaction to this. But a foreign enemy, the thing that they really hate us about is our way of life, the freedoms that we have. And any way that they can get us to do their work for them to remove freedoms is a gain in their advantage. That's why I tend to think this is more a foreign-based, I could be completely wrong, but to me it seems to be a foreign-based attack for that psychological thing. Oh, good, they're going to clamp down now. Now they're going to take away gunpowder, and they're going to take away their guns, and they're going to make people go through all kinds of checkpoints. And who knows, maybe they'll have to have biometrics and everybody registered they could even be on that street. And they win. Our society will end up looking like theirs, a totalitarian or, authoritarian, a police state. That's what they want. That's the obvious direction they're pushing this in, because the talking heads on TV, that's what you hear. What can we do to prevent this? And I heard some idiot on Fox News say, well, if the Constitution, it's not a suicide pact. In other words, look, if the Constitution ties their hands so we're getting shot and killed, let's just get rid of the Constitution. I was absolutely flabbergasted, but at the same time, I thought that's exactly the result an enemy would want.
That's a good point, Nolo, and that it stands to reason that they wouldn't necessarily, if it was an outside force, they wouldn't realize that by attacking liberals or liberal-minded people with that type of leaning, that would kind of go against the momentum of what has already been set up and is kind of, being pushed on us at this point. It would kind of cancel that out. So it kind of shows a lack of understanding of the mindset, possibly, of the American mindset.
That's exactly
That's a very compelling argument. I tend to agree with it. Also, when we jump into a war to retaliate against this sort of thing, we have a bad habit of destroying our international credibility by invading the wrong countries. Afghanistan, sure, there was some Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. If the official 9/11 was true, yeah, we should have gone. Iraq, on the other hand, not necessarily any Iraqis found in that whole 9/11 thing. But if you can destroy the freedoms from within and discredit and destroy the support across borders, then you've accomplished two things. And, this country usually only goes to war when there's markets involved.
Yeah, that like Entropy, for instance, they've got a bad habit. This country has a bad habit of lying to us about what they're going to war for. For instance, Afghanistan and the heroin market, Iraq and their oil, the potential for the lithium deposits that are in Afghanistan. But the people that are there know why they're there, in some cases. So it's like they have to tell, and I'm not necessarily going off on some spin like that. Everybody thought there were WMDs in Iraq after that, and of course it kind of sucks that it totally sucks that they didn't find any, and then they didn't get their asses out of there. And they were like, oh, by the way, while we're here, look at all this oil. You guys like oil, right? Well, what the hell? And it's still under the banner of spreading democracy, which goes against what the country was founded on, in my opinion.
Well, it also creates a lot of new enemies. I mean, when you go into a country, even if you go in under the right pretenses and you drop a bomb on a target and there happens to be a villager's house there, and it's the same effect that happens when a bomb blows up here in this country. You have some 8-year-old that just sees mommy and daddy in pieces. What's that 8-year-old going to grow up to do? They're going to grow up learning how to make bombs, how to get a passport, how to come over here, and how to get back.
Yeah, they're going to be a stakeholder in revenge at that point, not just an observer. And I can't really say I blame him. My dad, he was sprayed with Agent Orange when he was in Vietnam. Suffered from all kinds of skin stuff his whole life, and of course they never took any responsibility for it. He talked to him, and he's not the kind of guy that's going to sit there and kick around with him in court and shit for his whole life. So he tried when he got out, and they said no. He said okay. They said here, spray some of this antifungal medication on it. You'll be fine. Meanwhile, years and decades later, he dies of ischemic heart disease. And that happens to be one of these symptoms of the Agent Orange. My mother said, look at what happened. What's going on here? And they said, oh, well, let's cut you this check. Sorry about that. And it's like, well, how come it's okay after he's dead, but you couldn't recognize this fact? Oh, it's probably more expensive to treat him. Is what I came to the conclusion of, rather than just giving my mom $1,000 or whatever every month. And that, at that point, I'm like, wow, I'm almost a stakeholder going, I'm not really interested in fighting in the Army. That's not something I want to do. Look how they handled my family already.
That's just typical military mindset. They told us in Korea, if we hit somebody with a truck, make sure that you go back and run over them, because it's a standard cost, $20,000, and they're paid off if they're dead. But if they're alive, they can sue you for who knows how much, and they'll keep on paying and paying and paying. That was just standard understood when we were in Korea. I'm sure that's military-wide.
I believe you. It sounds just about right. I mean, it sounds like the situation. There's no right about it. But yeah, you're right, Noah.
And there's always going to be consequences about going after the right people. But let's just make sure we go after the right people. Because if there's consequences to the action of retaliation and justice, then that must be done justly in order to justify the cost of what we're doing.
So let me just introduce the possibility. I've seen a lot of posts on it. It was a false flag. Now you hear that all the time. But however, to keep in mind that if the agenda of the enemy is to reduce our freedoms and increase the police state over here, well, the other group that would be in favor of that is the police state. So you have to keep in mind, perhaps, whoever it is pulling the strings behind the scene would like to see an increased police state.
Right. The people that are authoritarians would likely only like to see more authority. And that's the old adage of, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that is twofold in a situation like this. One, there's no hiding it, there's no sweeping it under the rug because it was broadcast to millions of people. It was on live television. Two, a way to, as they say, never waste a crisis. So whether with their mindset of telling us one thing and doing another, perhaps this was some type of out country, another country performing a terror. I mean, it's pretty obvious. It looks that way. They're going to take care of that on one term. Another thing that they can do is spin this however they want. What they are looking at is, well, we've got this situation. How can we get the most out of it? Well, we can certainly say we need to buckle down and we need to have more TSA and we need to have more check stops and we need to completely disarm everyone. And because it's only 3 countries left that are armed. As far as I know, it's us, Israel, and Sweden, I think. Is Sweden or Switzerland? I get the two mixed up. So yeah, no, that could definitely push their agenda.
Not saying that we particularly did it, but we might have turned a blind eye and allowed it.
Well, that brings up another good point. There's a lot of talk on the forum, on Lunatic Outpost, of there being bomb-sniffing dogs, of there being... I can't confirm or deny it. This particular aspect of it, a bomb disposal unit, not only being active and near the site, but possibly having one of those, not demonstration, but one of those practice runs that they do. Like, if this happens, we'll go out and do a test and see how we're going to do. I forget the terminology for it. That, to me, when I first heard that, I can't verify that they were doing the practice run, but having the dog sniffing bombs there in such a fashion. And there were a couple other things, like when there's talk, and this is all hearsay because of course I don't have recordings of it or anything, that after the bomb went off, they were saying this is just what is that word that I'm looking for? This is just a drill. Them saying that this is just a drill, calm down, don't worry. There's even some reports of them saying it beforehand, of everybody just be calm, this is a drill. And then the bomb going off. Whether that part happened or not, the part afterwards where they're like, this is just a drill, that kind of got me thinking it's a possibility that one of the authorities was either tipped off or through, intelligence means knew that there was a possibility, which I'm sure there's always some type of possibility of this thing happening at a large event like that, but to have them rallied with a potential bomb squad on site, maybe they had some inside information, and that they didn't necessarily give that information to all the security working the site. So maybe some of these security guys were still thinking that this was part of this elaborate drill. And again, that's way out there in woo land because I don't have any evidence of that. But do you see what I'm saying? How it was like not everybody was in the loop. So they might have still been thinking, oh, this is just a drill, this is just a drill. Or even worse than that, they knew about it and are trying to calm people down by saying, this is just a drill, this is just a drill. What do you guys think about that?
Well, it's the Boston Marathon. If you're going to have a drill involving working with a large number of the public, that's probably the day you're going to do it in Boston. As far as the bomb-sniffing dogs, I'm still considering the possibility that they may have missed or hadn't even gotten to the area yet. Until the facts come out on it, I'm not willing to make a judgment call. Those dogs are trained to sniff out specific components of a bomb. A bomb-sniffing dog will not find, any bomb. They're not trained to find anything that may potentially explode. They're trained to look for the ingredients of bombs. To me, I'm going to wait till all the facts come out before I make a decision on it. But one thing to remember is, in order to have a false flag, you have to have a flag. You have to have something that you're blaming this on. And so far, they've interviewed a Saudi national. Now they're saying he's not associated with it. We have the potential of IRA involvement. Jessica Six pointed out in chat one day that the night it happened, and it was a good observation, that there was a court case an hour before the verdict was read in Boston, in which they ruled that the Boston College IRA tapes have to be turned over to authorities. And those tapes were interviews with members of the Irish Republican Army done by Boston College students or journalists or something. I don't know the whole story yet. But there's so many leads looking into this. Just to jump to automatic inside job or false flag, to me, is not utilizing our logical and rational assessment skills to discover all the facts of this case.
I've got a little bit of insight on that, on the IRA, the possible IRA connection there. The project that the Boston University created, this was 2001 to 2006, I believe, and the project was called the Belfast Project. And it was two journalists. One was former IRA member, McIntyre, Anthony McIntyre, and he turned journalist. And the other, I think, Maloney, I think, was the other journalist, and he interviewed some of the other side of those, the non-IRA members. The McIntyre, what he was trying to do was create an archive of what they called the Troubles in Ireland at that time, and that was during the early 70s. So Anthony McIntyre, a former IRA member turned journalist, he interviewed other former members of the IRA. Obviously, with his connections, he was able to get interviews with some important people. One of those important people was Dolores Price. She gave an interview with CBS Evening News, I believe it was in September, and she had admitted a role in the murder of Jean McConville, and Jean McConville is the highest profile murder case of the whole Troubles, end quote, time. So she basically, in this admission with CBS, led the British authorities to believe that there was information in these interviews that McIntyre had archived. And they, using, let me see if I can find it, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty between the U.S. and the U.K., are requesting those interviews from the Boston University. Now, Boston University put up a small fight, and then McIntyre and his partner, they put in a request to block that information. One, they said that they had, under the First Amendment, what's the exact term I'm looking for? They had press source confidentiality protection provided under the First Amendment. And that was their legal binding move to not allow those interviews to get out. Now, the agreement that the IRA members had with McIntyre and his partner were that the tapes weren't to be released in any form until after they had died, after the interviewees had died. Now, the catch in that is Dolores Price died. Of course, they were trying to get those interviews before she died last year. Oddly enough, Dolores was found dead in her apartment on the 24th of January of this year. And another strange thing in that, and she was only 61. Of course, she admitted to drugs and a lot of hard drinking, but the cause of death isn't being investigated in any fashion. So that kind of, they have an out with that. So then the second part of that is the college saying, look, if you are going to tamper with this, you're basically tampering with the ability for the press to glean this information, in troubled areas after troubled times, and it's basically going to make it more difficult for us to get an accurate assessment of history. And what we need that for is to prevent things like this from happening in the future. If you don't know your past, then you're doomed to repeat it. And as of April 15th, 2013, the request was denied, and the papers are being made available to the PSNI, which is the Police Service of Northern Ireland. So one of the highest profile cases, murder cases, it was execution style. And she was a mother of 10, and this was 1972. She was this is Jean McConville, who was the person who was murdered. She was suspected to be an informer against the IRA, and hence the possible execution-style murder. Her body was only found recently, like 30 years after this had happened, and it's an ongoing investigation, so that's why they're trying to get that information, and that's why it's topical, and it's not like the IRA hasn't blown anything up before. I'm certainly not saying that this was the IRA, but I could understand through some illumination how one could kind of make that connection, and this is an outside source, and they would like to see us getting possibly, out closer to a police state to harm the people, to look at our own laws, because from their perspective, they're performing civil disobedience. This is an act against an overreaching legal system that isn't providing the protection that it claims to protect these people. So this is, from what I understand, they consider this civil disobedience. Hello?
Hey.
No, I don't know one way or the other.
Yeah.
I'm trying to fit in my mind how that would fit. In other words, I'm trying to think, okay, I'm pissed off, I'm the IRA, what would be my target? Just grab anything at random, or Well, Boston, there's a lot of Irish there. Well, geez, it seems like you'd be blowing up Irish. Now that's counterintuitive. So I don't know. Yeah, it's
That's the
coincidental. I don't know, but huh.
Well, there was a lot of tourists there too, though. A lot of people from out of town, out of state.
Yeah, could be. I just can't quite see the connection. This is as strange as why did that room in the Kennedy Library blow up and start burning at the same time? They say it's unrelated, but it seems pretty strange to me. I'd like to know what the hell's in that room in the Kennedy Library that got exploded and burned up.
See, I thought
that's a
about
good
that
question.
too. I thought that it would be possible for them to move those interviews and the transcripts to another place, and what better place than a presidential library? So maybe more of a message than anything else. And it's not likely at all necessarily. That's one hell of a coincidence, though. IRA style bomb, an IRA thing in court. They're dealing with something of a library, which is where you would keep historical documents and things like that. It's just when you told me what Jessica said, and she didn't necessarily make that type of connection either. Just mentioning the coincidence, it kind of got the wheels turning in my head. And I'm Irish, so I'm not saying my people out there doing that.
I'm
Yeah.
quite.
Sometimes it's good to look at patterns. I mean, say for instance, here's the pattern. We had a large explosion, and right after that, here we get a senator that's being mailed. Was that ricin? Strangely enough, here's 9/11. We have a large explosion, and then right after that, there was a wave of anthrax mailings. Now, the two are probably unrelated. It's probably coincidence, and yet here's the same pattern. So what's the pattern telling us?
Yeah, there's a lot of threads on the forum without falling into the deep end of some of these theories, but that they're following like a script, and that's if you look at how some of the things have been taken, like I guess it is at the Reichstag fire that Hitler did to kind of fire people up and say, look what our enemies have done. That's a similar model to what might have happened at 9/11. You guys familiar with the Reichstag fires?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Yeah, he burnt down geez, was that a library? Let me look that up.
No, I think that was a government house. I think that was like their equivalent of a parliament house or something.
That makes better sense. I think you're right. There were some things that we know about the bomb, like the technical aspects of what we were able to observe and what's being released to the public through the news. I read on a forum that that the white smoke that we saw is usually present during like actual gunpowder. Nolo, you mentioned that the news had brought up the fact that the observers that were there smelled cordite.
Yeah, some were familiar with the smell and said it was cordite, which is, what you're going to smell with gunpowder.
Okay, so and then of course that's got its own little meaning. There, of course, there's been all the threads on the outpost of now they're going to come for your gunpowder. Where the Newtown slayings were the potential to kick off to the people that were worried about that the gun control issue. And of course, that seemed like that backfired. It seemed like they just cleaned out the shelves with ammunition for whatever reason. This being the second step to that, possibly, in conspiracy theory land, that the next item on the list that they would go after would be gunpowder. Which, if you're an authority figure.
If you want to take away the ammo, you also want to take away the ability to reload that ammo so that you're independent of having to buy ammo. As an unrelated note, maybe not unrelated, and I'm not certain of the timeline, whether it was the day before, that day, or maybe even a week before, but someone in the area, there in Massachusetts somewhere, found a grenade, called in the bomb squad. Bomb squad came out, and they determined that the grenade was empty. And they just said, okay, oh well. But if you had a supply of grenades and you emptied out the contents, well, you got a ready-made bomb.
Is that? I guess that would certainly be cordite. That's something that seems like the military would use in that type of situation, or at least gunpowder. I don't know how grenades are made.
It would be a similar substance, especially if it was an old grenade.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah, it wouldn't have the nano stuff or whatever they might use now. That's. I heard there was another thing that they had. I think it was in New Jersey. They found several like plastic containers that had chemical bombs in them, and like a lot of them, and many of these had already gone off, and they were all in trash cans. And I'm not sure if that's related or unrelated. And I don't have the link in front of me to give any more specific information. So this is just a topic for theory, but that's kind of strange.
It would be it would be significant if we saw events like this happen every other day or once a week or so. In other words, if this pattern continued, then that would be significant.
Agreed. There was talk that this was a pressure cooker that it was made from. Nolo, you said, did you see something on the news about that, Nolo?
Yes, they actually showed one of them saying this was the residue of one of the bombs. And, of course, it was all crumpled and messed up, but there were serial numbers on it, and they did trace that to some manufacturer in Georgia. The thing about a pressure cooker is it's practically airtight. So as far as the bomb sniffing dogs, you'd have to be really good. You'd have to assemble this thing in a clean room. You'd have to be pretty precise on how you put the bomb together. But once you got that pressure cooker sealed and you washed it down with acetate, you'd have a pretty good chance of the dog not being able to smell explosives.
That's a good point. When you mentioned that, two things popped into my mind. Number one, it's a large capacity pipe bomb, because really you're only going to get like a 2-inch, 3-inch pipe that you can fit this into. With varying lengths and stuff, you can make it fresh off the shelf with this pressure cooker that's made to hold in that pressure, which of course is just going to make the explosion worse when it goes off. Number two, like you said, the concealing the smell. Well, if they dump these in garbage bins, there's going to be a natural scent distractor in there from banana peels and pizzas and food and whatever else people are throwing in there.
Well, I wouldn't rely on that. I mean, these dogs are trained. I'm sure that they can detect, just like your eye can detect one photon of light. I think dogs can detect a molecule or two of this as explosives. So, incidental, probably where they place the bomb. That more has to do with concealment than the smell. I'm just thinking that a pressure cooker is so airtight that we think of it as building up pressure inside the thing, but it also works in reverse. In other words, if you pump the air out, once you assemble the bomb and you took the valve and you pumped the air out of the container and then sealed it, you've got, what's that, negative pressure? So in other words, you've got no molecules leaking out of the container because it's less than the atmospheric pressure. The air outside would be trying to get in, which also would make it a less detectable from the dog's point of view. I mean, if you were careful about putting together and you did not contaminate the outside of the container in any manner with the explosive, what you put into it, and then you were careful, washed it down with acetone or whatever, any kind of a harsh chemical, and then got rid of that, double washed, triple washed, whatever you had to do to sterilize the outside of the thing, then that I think you could be able to defeat a dog smelling your explosives.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, because it would you would be worried about. I mean, and not that I've been involved in this, but what drug smugglers are worried about is the drugs eventually permeating their container, and like you said, by creating that negative force, the vacuum in there, it would be drawing stuff in. That's like high science right there.
Well, yeah, then that tells you something about the sophistication of it. So, if you're sophisticated enough to time the things, then your timing of it was deliberate, not at the very end of the race, but during the race. Also, the positioning of it, how you time the two to go one after the other, and where you placed it, is deliberate. In other words, I can't see you being deliberate in one step of this and being sloppy in another. So if you take all these factors together, then what they did was deliberate. So you say, well, it's kind of accidental that they tried to cut everybody off at the knee. No, I think that was deliberate. That the fact that they got during the middle of the race rather than the beginning of the race, I think that was deliberate. What those things signify, I'm not entirely sure, but whoever put the things together and set them off, I think they had something in mind. If you can extrapolate from the facts that you do have, maybe you can determine why they did what they did, and from that, you might be able to determine who did it.
Right, because they're going to be patterns, and the same type of patterns from the same type of people doing this kind of stuff.
It's the patterns that give you away.
Good thinking. I was considering the delay in the bomb, and I thought there was possibly two things to think about in that situation. One, if they're being operated from a cell phone, you would have maybe one person like hit speed dial, knock the first one off, hit another, hang up, hit speed dial, and knock the other one off, because that's about that 3 or 4 second difference in the time that it would take to dial and connect. The second observation, you've got a large group of people coming up towards the finish line. Once they see this explosion, they're going to turn around and run back, and almost like cattle get funneled into a certain area, possibly right around where that second bomb went off, and do maximum destruction.
Which does kind of break the pattern of how most of these double bombs operate. Usually, a small bomb would go off. It draws in the crowd, and the second one goes off in the same place because it drew in the crowd. This was set a little different than that. Here, this is kind of off the subject, but watching a couple of these film clips, okay, this goes back to perhaps false flag or perhaps people were tipped off. Do you notice the people that did rush in to help? Of all the people that rushed, did you notice against the fence line? Now, maybe the police were given instructions, stand there no matter what. Most of them milled around still in the street. It was very rare to see a cop go in to the crowd to assist. Most of the cops I saw were still out in the street, still standing by the barricades. Now, whether that's maybe, waiting for somebody to tell them what to do, or I don't know. It may be significant, maybe not.
I did see in a lot of the pictures, people booking ass, like civilians booking ass, and the cops just kind of standing around, so I can confirm that I saw similar actions. Of course, they're trained, and in bomb training, of course, I'm not a cop, they might be aware that there's a second bomb, like because this was real big when they did abortion bombings way back in the day. I remember a specific event where they had a small bomb go off, and then maybe even like an hour or 45 minutes later, the big one went off and just shredded people. And so they might have something in their training manual about not necessarily rushing in, where EMS is rush in, and beyond that, it's the Good Samaritan clause, which normally it would say get these people out on stretchers, don't hurt them if they've got lower extremity damage. If you take them out in a wheelchair or you drag them out, you're just going to proliferate. You're just going to add more to their damage. But then there's a law that says no. If there's a possibility of them dying, take the risk. You get them out of there any way that you can, which kind of deflates the why would they put that guy with the leg, or injury in a wheelchair? Well, they're just trying to get him the hell away from the scene, just in case the next thing that happens. So there's kind of a training thing. I don't know, but that's a good point, Nolo, about the cops just kind of not really running in to do much, just standing around observing.
I'd have to watch a lot of the film clips to really determine if that was so. It's just something I just kind of out of the corner of my eye sort of caught my attention. That's something really somebody needs to study. Were they really just standing there the whole time after all this happened, or what was? Am I mistaken in my observation?
Absolutely, I agree. The only other specific point that seems relevant, it possibly, are the fact that there were the Newtown parents there. of course, that's probably a coincidence. They've kind of trotted them around to all kinds of major events, and it was a fact that the race was ran in memorialization of that incident. So of course, it would make sense to have them there.
I didn't know that it was run in their honor. Now that does lend some significance to the fact that they were there to observe it. It psychologically kind of steals their thunder.
That's true. That's true. It kind of takes away from their message. We did find out that none of the Newtown parents were injured.
That's right. No, none of them were injured.
Okay, so that's fortunate. You know, not adding fuel to that fire. Me with the horrible puns tonight.
Well, you know, if their message is anti-violence, which I can agree with, but they've narrowed the focus down to individual ownership of weapons. Well, the kind of anti-violent, how can how can they? In other words, here's violence in front of them that has nothing to do with what they're advocating and all. So it kind of takes away their anti-violence message. Is it? What are you going to do? Pass a law against bombs? I mean, well, duh.
And that goes along with the idea of it not necessarily being someone familiar with American politics and American propaganda right now. Because again, hitting people that are already against weapons and firearms, and specifically the people who are, you know, the poster children, the front runners of that argument being there, and this not having anything to do with specific firearms, you know, and weapons of that sort.
That's right. The basics is, you know, you're afraid of the boogeyman called violence, and you think you have a cure for it, and then it's right in your face. Well, that cure ain't gonna work, you know. So,
thank you for listening to Lopsided Discussion. I appreciate our hosts Nolo and Entropy for showing up, and don't forget to check out lunaticoutpost.com for all your conspiracy, UFO, and fun needs. Have a good night.